This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Cool. Let's get this Friday show rolling. Hope everyone's doing well. It is time to dive into some classic coverage. You all know how the Friday show works. If you've been following my channel already, this is the Five Starr Wrestling Report, the YouTube and Rumble Wrestling podcast that nobody knows but everybody needs. And I'll still always encourage everybody to try to check us out on Rumble over YouTube. But I also understand the reality of where we are in 2024. Rumble's making strides, but YouTube's still got a huge footing over them. But no matter where you're watching, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show. Come back and check out the FSWR podcast on Mondays and Fridays for new shows and new content. As I am piecing this show together right now, I'm also trying to get a head start on some other things. Because as I look ahead to next weekend, there's like 3 shows I have to cover for next Monday's podcast. We have WWF In Your House, the last Raw of the year for 1995. I also forgot that WWE is doing Saturday night's main event. There's no way I'm going to have the time or the energy to try to watch all 3 of those shows over the weekend. I'm sort of handcuffed when it comes to the Saturday night's main event PLE. So I actually went ahead and watched In Your House yesterday. That way next weekend I just have to worry about Retro Raw and the WWE PLE. I might even have some time to squeeze in the next NWA show. Maybe on like a Sunday. I mean, I try to be strategic with how I go about spacing things out. I used to try to cram all the territory shows into Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And by the time I got finished watching World Class, I was exhausted. I'd have to either start late or get up early the next day and record all the audio for the podcast, and it was a lot. I was getting burnt out rather quickly. So right now it's just a matter of me trying to keep my shit organized over the next week. Trying to remember how I'm saving all these Word documents where I'm tracking my notes for the shows. I got like 4 of them open right now. I think this one's correct. NWA World Championship Wrestling from December 10th, 1988. Sounds right. This is technically the episode that would have aired after the Clash event. I'm not sure if they taped it before or after the Clash. But we are in the home stretch before Starrcade 88. At this point, they've pretty much facilitated most, if not all, of the card. If you didn't check out last Friday's show, make sure you set aside a little bit of time to at least listen to the Clash of Champions recap I did. You will definitely want to hear my thoughts on the Ric Flair Barry Windham versus Midnight Express main event. That was a great tag match. Definitely one of the highlights of all the classic content I've reviewed this year. And of course, now we're back at the Atlanta studios a week later for this taping block, and now we're kind of back to the realm of mostly boring squash matches. It was kind of like coming down from a high. I I can confidently confirm that by the time the show was over, nothing on this show came remotely close to Flair and Wyndham versus Eaton and Lane, including the Fantastics versus Terry Jones and Rick Allen. And I know you're all thinking, what? Oh, come on. That sounds like an explosive tag team showdown. Well, it wasn't. The Fantastics are now the new United States Tag Team Champions. If you watch my Clash review, you would already know that. They beat Eddie Gilbert and Ron Simmons in the tournament finals to a rousing set of boos from the Tennessee crowd. They were not happy to see their hometown boy Eddie Gilbert doing a clean job to the Fantastics. I think the only time in history Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers became the de facto heels in a given program. Really not too much to comment on with this one, aside from me laughing at the fact that Rick Allen could not apply a basic standing headlock. I'm not shitting you. It was the single worst headlock attempt I've seen anybody try to apply on another human being. I've seen middle school boys with zero training experience apply more convincing headlocks. But Bobby and Tommy took turns working both guys over. They won with their assisted flipping senton thing. By the way, does anybody actually know what they called that move? I don't know why, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody ever reference that finisher with a proper name. I've always just called it the wacky flipping assisted senton dealia bob, which is probably my favorite made-up finisher I've ever coined. Then we came back after break for a Russian Assassins versus Eddie Sweat and Bill Holiday match. This quickly became my favorite segment of the entire week. And not for anything that happened in the match. The match sucked. This is all Paul Jones. He was in peak heel mode for this week's program. Now again, everything I'm about to say is implying that you already followed along with the series and actually listened to my Clash review from last Friday. Not to try and pull a Tony Khan where I just automatically assume everybody knows what's going on. If you watch the review, Ivan Koloff beat Paul Jones clean, despite having wrestled the entire match with one arm tied behind his back. Jones tried to sneak in a gimmick last minute to blindside Koloff, but then Koloff turned the tables and then outsmarted Jones to get the pin. But of course, immediately after the match, the Assassins hit the ring and started ganging up on Ivan. So even though the babyface won, the heels got the last laugh in the segment. So naturally, as you would expect, Paul Jones, the slimy dirtbag heel that he is, he's cutting a promo at the booth, totally self-satisfied with everything that happened last week, talking about how he beat Ivan within an inch of his life. He had Ivan on the ground begging for mercy. And now it's only a matter of time before he and his Russian assassins take out Ivan for good. Meanwhile, Jim Ross, the direct state-of-fact ring announcer that he was, just goes, "Is Paul talking about the same match we watched?" I'm dead serious, man. I'm going to be so sad when Paul's no longer a part of the weekly broadcast. I mean, as god-awful as so many of his segments have been over the last couple years, you could always rely on number one Paul Jones to bring a smile to your face, especially when you needed some comedic relief on the program. They also made reference to JYD here, since he also made his debut at the Clash, coming to the aid of Uncle Ivan in a mass beatdown. They made zero mention, however, of anything regarding Nikita Koloff, almost as if they were trying to ghost him entirely on purpose. So they're just talking about JYD here as if he's always been a part of the feud. Of course, we all know that's bullshit. But they got to put some kind of closure to this rivalry. So instead of outright dropping it, they just said, fuck it, we'll put Junkyard Dog in there. People won't think anything of it. Then we get another Starrcade card update from Tony and JR. They were very insistent on making sure the fans knew to call their local cable providers for availability before everybody went on holiday vacation. So they were plugging the 23rd of December as the cutoff date, or the deadline. Because if fans were expecting to get in touch with anyone on the 24th, 25th, or 26th, and they were going to be shit out of luck. Highly unlikely anybody was working the customer service lines. No. Of course, they could have avoided these problems altogether if they'd have just kept the fucking pay-per-view slotted for Thanksgiving week like it traditionally was, but hey, what do I know? I've never been dumb enough to try to run a pay-per-view the day after Christmas. By the way, this is funny. As they're running the final VTR advertisement for Starrcade, they immediately come out of it with the Road Warriors hitting the ring to beat up Chuck Casey and Reno Riggins for the next squash. There was no subtle transition. It was just pay-per-view advertisement and then boom. Road Warriors are in the ring destroying two worthless scrubs. Oh, by the way, for anybody curious, if the name Reno Riggins sounds familiar, you're not hallucinating. We've actually seen him work WWF squashes on Raw over the last couple years. Of course, he was still an enhancement guy. But I did notice that here. I was like, huh. I know Reno Riggins. We've seen him before. He somehow survived a Road Warrior squash in the late 80s and then came back to have a moderately successful career as a WWF enhancement jobber. Hey, good on him, man. I respect anybody that gets in the ring with Hawk and Animal and then manages not to be confined to an iron lung for the rest of their lives. That's the comeback of the century right there. Then we came back for a fun little tag match. Another debut of sorts, even though Kendall Windham's already been part of the show before. It was actually his partner who's the new face to the area. Some young chap named Dustin Rhodes. Dustin Rhodes. You know, that name does sound oddly familiar somehow. I should probably do some research later. So yes, Dustin made his official World Championship Wrestling debut here in 1988. A mere 19 years old, I believe he was at this point. 19. And holy cow, did he ever look it too. And this had to have been just weeks after he was wrestling in Florida, right? How long was Dustin down there before he came to the Carolinas? It was only like a month or two, right? I mean, he was like fresh into the business here. Barely into like month 2 of his training. You could tell how green he was. Yeah, he and Kendall actually worked together for a little bit under this tag team called the Texas Broncos, which is about as short-lived as Dustin's initial WCW run. Actually, I'm pretty sure this was shorter. Nobody remembers a single thing about the Texas Broncos, and for understandable reasons. It was shorter than a hiccup as far as longevity goes. But it was a way for Dustin to get his foot in the door and not immediately get pooned for getting slapped with a nepotism card. I mean, by this point, Dusty had essentially lost all control as a booker anyway, so I don't think it really mattered. Because Dustin's only around, I think, through January of next year. It was right up until Dusty officially leaves WCW, for obvious reasons. But yeah, he's really not around for that long. Here was our very first look at a young Dustin Rhodes, without all the bells and whistles. No face paint. No goofy homoerotic gimmicks. He's just good old Southern boy, son of a former booker and promoter. And they wrestled a very odd combination of Mike Jackson and Cruel Connection #1. Talk about drawing random names out of a hat. I noted here, Dustin trying to be edgy in 1988 by sporting the blonde mohawk. Boy, am I glad that look was only temporary. I'll tell you though, man, I'm actually kind of disappointed this team never went anywhere. They look good together. They kind of had that market appeal of being the younger, good-looking, clean-shaven tag team with the flashy athletic ability. It kind of like a Fantastics or even a Brad Armstrong, Tim Horner-like pairing. I mean, they work cohesively. Crowd was digging their stuff. Kendall looked really good here. You could tell he was filling out more physically. God, remember how I used to rag on how skinny and frail he looked back in 87? The dude actually showed up here with a physique. His biceps were bigger. His shoulders were broader. He actually kind of looked like an athlete of some description. Of course, the one thing they both had going for them was that they were huge. God, they had to be like, what, 6'4", 6'5"? I mean, Dustin was always a lanky dude. He scored on the heights genetics. I never really realized how big Kendall was, though. But yeah, this is a lot of fun. Short and easy tag match to get over Dustin with the people. Didn't overstay its welcome. It was good seeing Kendall come back and seeing him drastically improve since last we saw him. Yeah, again, it's just kind of sad this duo doesn't really go anywhere beyond this. Because come January, the Rhodes family is essentially blackballed from WCW entirely. You know, at least until they come back a few years later after things had kind of cooled off with the Turner office. But that took us to Eddie Gilbert and Ron Simmons versus Bear Colley and Mike Justice. Holy fuck, this match. This is legendary. Oh, by the way, if you're noticing a pattern develop this week, there's a noticeable lack of promo/interview time. Don't ask me why. Apparently that's another changeover as part of the new regime. I guess they didn't want to flood the entire studio with promos because, well, promos are boring, pal. Nobody wants to see any of that. They want to see some hot wrestling action. Well, they gave us plenty of action this week. I would not necessarily call it hot. No offense to Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. One thing the announcers addressed was Eddie wrestling with the thick layer of tape on his left arm here, which is kind of a story holdover from the Clash event when he and Simmons were wrestling the Fantastics. There was a point in the match where Eddie had injured his arm, and he had already been having problems with that arm previously. So they actually kind of let the job guys get some heat on Gilbert here. And I would say things were going moderately okay. And then Big Bear Colley's cardio caught up with him. The last 2 minutes of this match were something to behold. You guys remember that Ahmed Johnson match we covered the other week where he and that job guy fucked up virtually every spot they tried to do? Remember I called it the worst squash match I've ever seen? This may have been worse. Colley gets in there with Simmons during the comeback. And let me just start by saying this. I can solely put the blame on Colley for being a fat, out-of-shape fuckwit. That was only part of the problem here. Ron Simmons and Eddie Gilbert could clearly tell this guy was gassed out. But God damn it, they had to get their shit in. So they were going to force Bear Colley to push through to the end, regardless of how rotten everything looked in the process. Ron goes to shoot Colley off the ropes. It was literally like watching a freight train run out of gas in real time. Colley's running to hit the ropes while Simmons is doing drop downs and leapfrogs. Just another day at the office in the training world for Ron Simmons. By the time we got to like the fourth rotation of rope running, you could just see the needle hit empty mode for poor Colley. He had nothing left in the tank. And he was barely walking by the end of that sequence. So he and Simmons try for something, and it totally failed. I don't even know what the hell they were attempting to do. And then Eddie Gilbert tagged in and tried to give Colley the stun gun. This also failed because Colley wouldn't go up for Gilbert. So when all else fails, as the old saying goes, try and try again. Well, they tried again. And Colley proceeded to fuck up the stun gun spot a second time. And this is where you could see Eddie Gilbert was pissed. He was so mad. But again, he just wouldn't pin the guy when he had the opportunity to do so. He had to fucking send the message. So, in realizing that Bear Colley was not going to cooperate with him on the stun gun, Eddie takes him out to the floor. He DDTs him on the concrete as hard as humanly possible. He then throws him back into the ring like the biggest sack of shit in the world. And then after he finally pins Colley, you just see Eddie Gilbert looking down with a look of disdain. Like he and Simmons were probably thinking, this guy was so bad and so winded, we have to make sure everybody knows it. Literally, that's the only explanation I could come up with. They wouldn't just end it after the first botch. They had to go another full minute while Big Bear Colley's in there sucking wind and fucking up spots left and right. And keep in mind, this is the ridiculous part of the whole thing. This is a taped show. They could have edited all of this out, but they kept it in. Unreal. You know, say what you want about the modern athletes of today. It's easy enough for us old-timers to joke about how everybody looks like a jobber these days, especially in AEW. But I will say this up front, without hesitation. Danny Garcia is a much better professional athlete than 95% of these studio jobbers. Not even a fucking question. Just like, how? That's really what I want to know. when you get down to the bottom of the issue, I want to know how in the world any of these guys ever got on television. Did they at least screen to make sure guys could properly hit the ropes without getting blown up after 30 seconds? Well, I guess I answered my own question, didn't I? The answer was no, apparently not. See Big Bear Collie as the example. Holy shit. And so then we follow that with not an interview segment at the booth. No, instead we had the announcers pitching to a pre-taped segment they shot of one of the Sunday syndicated programs. Again, just more of this weird, strange historical content that I either totally forgot about or had very little recollection of until they actually mentioned it on the show. I was vaguely familiar with Jim Cornette's Louisville Slugger Talk segment. I mean, it's something I've heard him talk about on his podcast plenty of times. But as far as like any memorable sit-downs or angles they ever shot, I mean, I didn't even really remember the one they did here with him and Paul E. It's just one of those things where you look back and go, it's WWF, but without all the high-level production or over-the-top gimmick decoration. And they got what's essentially this giant staging platform off to the side of the building. They got these ugly-looking basket-woven chairs sitting there. And like the whole idea is JC trying to get Paul to come out to confront him. And he's calling Paul a yellow belly coward. Of course, Paul refuses to have the standoff with him, and eventually Paul makes his way out and hesitates to confront Cornette until he puts the racket down. So after he does so, that was Paul's cue to start going off on how Corny's Midnight Express had been beaten up multiple times by the Paul Midnight Express. Or Paul's Midnight Express. And he's already getting word from Turner execs that they're planning to replace Cornette altogether so Paul can steal his spot. Apparently George Scott was already leaking shit to Paul Heyman behind the curtain. And or somebody in upper management. So eventually Cornette pops Heyman in the mouth with a right hand. He goes to try to shove his bloody suit jacket down his throat, as he's promised to do so on multiple occasions. And that's when things break down with both Midnight Express tag teams. A good old-fashioned Pier 6 alleyway brawl breaking out. They're beating each other over the head with gimmicks and pretty much anything they could get their hands on. And you know, it's one of those pre-tapes where, again, nothing is poorly executed. It's just one of those ideas that you can kind of tell got pushed on them by somebody in the office. Somebody that obviously watched WWF tapes and thought this kind of shit would be cool to do. It's like, I mean, the brawl worked for the crowd, sure. I guess it's just the Jerry Springer argument of chaos for the sake of chaos. And like the whole setup with the goofy chairs and the whole stage production aspect of everything. This is the kind of stuff that became synonymous with the WWF. Stagey talk show segments that evidently led to chaos and fighting. And while it may have worked for them, I mean, you weren't really used to seeing it all that frequently with WCW. But then it kind of just became the norm over time when they started booking more of the stuff on a frequent basis. And it just kind of came off like a poor attempt at copying the opposition. Yeah, maybe I'm being too critical of it, but I don't know. Again, nothing about it was bad. I didn't really like it. And in keeping with the theme of nobody apparently being able to cut interviews or promos at the booth this week, and when Cornette went and introduced the Midnight Express here for their match with Kurt Thompson and El Negro, Well, he was already in the ring. No witty promo banter. No pot shots at Paulie or the original Midnights. Just, ladies and gentlemen, the Midnight Express. At least he was given the green flag to join them on commentary during the match. I did like his comment. Paulie wouldn't make friends at a state penitentiary with a blowtorch and a hacksaw. So, I mean, this is just another case of two professionals trying to get a watchable match out of a brick wall. Was El Negro always this fucking tall? I do not remember him towering over Bobby or Stan. And or being this overweight. And again, like, the whole psychology makes absolutely no sense. Bobby and Stan clearly know this guy fucking sucked. You had Kurt Thompson in there, who, as we've talked about before, was a reasonably good athlete that could actually do some stuff. So, rather than keep Thompson in the match for the most part, the Midnights were looking for every excuse to keep El Negro as the legal partner. And even Bobby Eaton couldn't figure out what to do with a fucking giant baked potato. Negro could not bump. He could not feed for anything offensively. I like the one part where Stan gave him a karate kick and Negro just took a pratfall onto his back while kicking one of his legs in the air. I already gave Stan shit for the terrible karate kicks, but I'm not even going to blame him for this one. This was just Negro not knowing how to bump for anything. I'm not convinced this was the same guy that's always wrestled under that hood. This had to have been somebody else. A decoy. Oh, and the finish was great too. Bobby gives him the elbow drop. He tags in Stan so he could go for the pin. But you see Stan turn to Bobby and whisper something to him. Probably like, double team. Then Bobby just shakes his head as Stan goes to pin him. Even Bobby Eaton was like, nah, just end it, dude. And then, holy crap. Coming up on hour 2 of the program, I think we had our very first promo at the actual booth. Of course, it was Jim Cornette talking, which was kind of an extension of stuff he previously said during the match. I was starting to think we were going to go an entire week where nobody got to do a promo. They finally broke up that flow. So he's ripping into Paul and the Midnights some more, recapping a lot of the footage we previously saw where Lane and Eaton sent Condrey and Rose running for higher grounds. But when it comes to JC, he's man enough to stand here and talk about how he's been in a fair share of his fights over the last few years. He hasn't won a single one of them. And in fact, he got his ass kicked by a girl at one point. But Cornette has finally found his equal. The one man he knows he can confidently beat in a fight. And the next time he gets his hands on Paul Heyman, he's going to stick his fist so far down his throat, he'll have toenails jutting out the other end. He said Paulie couldn't whip cream with an outboard motor. One of my favorite JC witticisms. And, I mean, the promo was pretty great. I love the whole setup, too. My name is Jim Cornette. I've never won a single fight in my life. But even I know I can beat Paul Heyman's ass. And everybody cheers as a result because they know it's true. I just kind of wish they didn't already spoil it when Jim sucker punched Heyman in that pre-tape. I'd have thought they would have saved that moment for Starrcade. It is sort of the main draw in that feud, let's be honest. I mean, the work between the Midnights is going to be good, but the actual selling point for that feud, I mean, that's going to be JC getting his hands on Paul. So they've kind of already spoiled the goods. But hey, whatever. We got an actual honest-to-God promo on television this week. Small favors. Then we had another Commandos tag squash, which I really didn't know much about. I laughed at seeing them beat up Keith Steinborn and Randy Hogan. Commando Ray and Commando Boone. The most forgettable tag team of the 80s. I mean, they were literally here until Starrcade, and then they both vanish after the pay-per-view. They did a lot of slow, lumbering offense to the job guys, and then one with a double running warrior splash. Pretty sure Boone landed right on top of Randy Hogan's head, which I also laughed at. And that led directly to this pre-taped Dusty interview with Jim Ross. Chance for Dusty to comment on the fallout to the Clash event. He actually covered a lot of ground here. He first put over that he was intentionally trying to take out Animal's leg with the chair. After what the Road Warriors tried to do with Dusty's eye. Dusty wasn't going to let the Road Warriors sleep at night, knowing they got the better of the American dream. Oh, by the way, just a sidebar relating to the eye injury. Yes, Dusty was wearing shades here. You notice how they've completely dropped the eye injury angle? I mean, you can even see that Dusty's eye isn't even bandaged up. They were very quick to make sure that people forgot about the spike angle. Even though nobody did, because we're still talking about it all these years later. Anyway, he somehow gets onto a rant about him being a 3-time World Heavyweight Champion. No idea how that had any relevance to the situation, but it's Dusty. He referred to Paul Ellering at one point as a pencil neck geek holding a newspaper, which I thought was kind of humorous. He said the Road Warriors haven't been World Tag Team Champions long enough to know what it's like to fight and defend belts of such prestige. Meanwhile, I'm like, weren't Dusty and the Road Warriors the 6-man tag team champions for like a year and a half straight? Yeah, granted, they never defended the belts, but it's not like the Road Warriors weren't considered champions at any point. And this is the best part. We basically had one of those fuck you TBS diatribes where Dusty made sure to let everybody know that he's the heart and soul of the NWA. The Bull of the Woods, Mr. TBS, Mr. NWA. Basically inferring that, yeah, I know I'm fired, but I just want to make sure everybody in the company knows that I'm the guy in this fucking place. Nobody's in my league. And you know, it's hard to argue with him. He may not be the World Heavyweight Champion, but when you think of bedrocks and foundations of the National Wrestling Alliance, it's hard not to think about Dusty first and foremost. He was not about to let Turner get the last laugh. Then we had Bam Bam Bigelow and Craig Brown. Bam Bam won with the front face gourd buster. Oliver Humperdinck at one point suggested J.J. Dillon has a foot fetish. I don't know what was going on here, nor did I really care. And then they immediately followed that with the PWI End of the Year Awards segment, featuring Bill Apter. I think they actually did this the last couple years, where they had Apter appear on the show, presenting the boys with some trophy or plaque awards for the various categories. I personally never put much stock in the awards. And I guess at this point in the industry, it wasn't a total joke like it is nowadays. PWI at least had more credibility than, say, the Wrestling Observer does. God, I can't even stomach to listen to the results of those award presentations. And the 40-something marks that actually sent in ballots for those fucking things. But they had Apter in a pre-tape here revealing 3 awards for the NWA talents. This ended up becoming a fucking amazing segment by the end. 19,567 votes for the most improved talent of the year. That award going to Sting. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. The plaque explicitly read most improved. Wasn't that just the same as Rookie of the Year? Or were those two entirely different categories? Well, in any case, the best part, Dusty accepted the plaque on behalf of Sting, since Sting was apparently in training for his match with the Road Warriors at Starrcade. So, Dusty's there just being Dusty, holding the plaque like it's his most prized possession. Which made it even funnier when he asked Bill Apter, "Who had the feud of the year, Daddy? Was that me?" Bill Apter goes, "That was Luger versus Flair, not you, Dusty." And then Dusty tries to immediately pass it off like, "Well, that certainly was a feud, but let me tell you something about feuds. I was in a lot of feuds this year, Daddy." Just like, what the fuck? Like, that's all you can do. You can't even get mad at him. You just have to laugh. This out-of-control egomaniac. Never change, Big Dust. Never change. And as far as Manager of the Year goes, that award went to J.J. Dillon. I could easily dispute that vote if I wanted to, but I'll accept it. I did appreciate that JJ's promo was all about him talking about his goal being to make sure Barry Windham and Ric Flair leave Starrcade as champion. Because by God, that is what a manager needs to do. Put your boys over and make them the center of attention. Yeah, he could have easily made it all about himself, but he knows what the bigger picture is. And then, of course, kind of goes without saying, 4 years running, Tag Team of the Year. Well, that award went to the Road Warriors. Only this time, we got to hear them cut a promo as heels. So now they're poking fun at Bill Apter and joking about wanting to use their plaques as cutting boards for bread and cheese. It is like Animal said here. Love them or hate them. You have to respect that they're men that keep their word. When they say they're going to beat people up and show their dominance, by God, they mean it. And of course, the other thing you have to keep in mind here, when you're watching the boys receive the awards, it's all still kayfabe. That's probably why there was a shred of credibility going back to these award ceremonies. Because regardless of whether or not the fans voted for a face or a heel, yeah, they were insiders, and most of the voters, if not all of them, knew about the business. They knew it was fake. But, the talents were still in character when they accepted their awards. I mean, these days, God, could you imagine anybody keeping kayfabe? That'd be completely redundant. Because nobody's trying to protect the business anymore. So, I mean, again, I never really liked the whole concept of the award presentations. I just always kind of thought it was lame. But I can at least respect the boys for going out of their way to stay true to their gimmicks. Probably the only fan in history that hated and still hates the whole concept of award ceremonies in wrestling. I just kind of always saw them as formalities. And again, who's voting? That's the critical issue. Are they credible sources? Or are they just marks that are all about trying to get their guys over and not actually voting for real winners of various categories? Do I agree with all the winners here? No, not really. And these were only a hand-select group of them, so I'm sure if I went to PWI's website, there were probably even more disagreements that I had with who considered the winners of these various categories. Like, I think the Midnights had a way better run in 1988 than the Road Warriors. I mean, their feuds were better, their matches were better. And Hawk and Animal were in Japan for like 5 out of the 12 months. They were barely even around for the Bash Tour. Again, it's not a total bullshit thing. I don't really see the value in it. I never have. So anyway, then we had Lex Luger at the booth, talking about the match with Flair at Starrcade. You remember there was a stipulation they were talking about a few weeks ago. Flair and JJ were angry because there was a clause that they wrote into their contract after they had already signed it. Well, we found out what that mystery clause was. If Flair does anything to get himself intentionally disqualified, the belt will automatically be awarded to Luger on a forfeit. Which is kind of what I figured the stipulation would be. So, Luger. Well, he talked about some stuff. Did he ever get to a point? No. He never fucking does. He said that Christmas Day will take place on the 26th. Because it'll be the night he finally beats Flair for the World Heavyweight title. He then tries to suggest the match is going to be no disqualification. Even though JR and Tony outright said at the beginning of the program, it is not a no DQ match. So even Luger doesn't know what the fuck's going on. And he's talking. And he's talking. And he's talking. The interview is dying a slow, torturous death. I'm waiting for them to finally cut the cord. No sooner should I say that, here comes, of all people, Rick Steiner. And this part had me dying, because Luger is right in the middle of ranting and screaming about Flair. And as soon as Steiner comes in and starts causing a scene, Luger just stops what he's doing, calmly turns to look at him. He smiles, and he goes, "Hey, what's going on, Rick?" Then he just looks back at the camera and continues screaming at Flair. Awesome. That almost made up for the promo. Just that one bit. So, of course, Steiner's scheduled to wrestle JC Wild or whatever. But because he's Rick Steiner, he's wasting time talking to his friend Alex. Somehow a small Christmas tree has made its way over to the podium so Steiner could put an ornament at the top of it. I'm saying to myself, only Rick fucking Steiner was ever capable of getting something like that over. Strictly because you knew the minute that bell rang, he was all business. He could act like a total goof on camera and make a complete idiot out of himself. But then he gets in the ring and starts throwing dudes around. And you're like, you know what? I ain't trying to pick a fight with that guy. If he claims to have a friend named Alex, I'm not going to argue with him. Now, you see, these days, we commonly refer to those kinds of people as schizophrenics. Nah, in 1988, it was just Rick Steiner being Rick Steiner. So, yeah, he killed J.C. Wilde here. I probably don't need to specify that, but there you go. That took us to Barry Windham in his full-fledged gunslinger cowboy outfit. He wrestled Gary Royal. I believe Tony referred to them as leather chaps. He just decided he was going to wrestle in chaps this week. Why not? This is great. Barry spent the whole match just picking up Royal and throwing him across the ring like a sack of shit. Because, again, Barry Windham was really fucking strong. And then after toying around with Royal for a little bit, he just decked him with a lariat and then put him away with a claw hold. And that took us to JR at ringside for a Ric Flair interview. Probably one of the more calm, cool, and collected Flair promos we've seen as of late. He's selling the importance of Starrcade. Simple fact that this match with Luger may be his toughest challenge to date. The World's Heavyweight title has been the premier singles championship in wrestling for over 80 years. And the burden is on Flair's back to get the job done and solidify himself as the best in the sport. Yeah, he knows what's at stake. And when it comes to Luger, he's in for the fight of his life. He's got to stand toe-to-toe with the best in the world and be on Flair's level. It's, it's all the same typical mumbo-jumbo we've heard Flair talk about 1,000 times. You could probably copy and paste this exact promo when we've heard it in some incarnation over the last 12 months. Credit to them, though. They're really trying to market this title match as the big one. I would argue it doesn't really have the same vibe as the Bash Tour match did, simply because so many people are expecting Luger to win that match. And when you watch how they've gone about building up the rematch here for Starrcade, and they're trying. It's probably the best I can say about it. I mean, it's Flair versus Luger, and well, of course, we already know what happens in the match, so I'm a little biased. But, I don't know, did anybody actually think Luger was winning the belt in Norfolk? I'm just going back and revisiting the timeline. The way they get to this point after having teased Bam Bam versus Flair for weeks. Luger was all involved in the Road Warrior feud with Sting until they swapped him with Dusty last minute. Now it's oh yeah, remember that Luger versus Flair feud that we completely dropped after Bash season? Time to ramp up enthusiasm for that rematch. We had the OG Midnights versus the Menace and Jerry Price, which is mostly just an infomercial for Paulie to do an inset promo at the podium. He's talking about how the original Midnights are responsible for driving Cornette and his Midnight Express to extreme lengths. They're inside their heads, and it's only made them more confident ahead of their match for Starrcade. Yeah, really nothing remarkable to talk about here. Dennis gave the Menace one of the worst brainbusters I've ever seen. I've also just involuntarily come up with the best tag team that never was. Dennis and the Menace. There's a great pairing right there. Could have taught the Menace everything he knows. Anyway, that led to a J.J. Dillon Barry Windham promo, which was highly unremarkable. Talked about Starrcade. JJ said their only focus is to make sure Barry leaves as United States Heavyweight Champion. And then, as God is my witness, I'm not making this up. This is almost a direct line from Barry here. Quote, "Let me tell you something, Bam Bam. If you want to make a comparison between yourself and me, well, there is none." Yeah, by the way, that awkward silence, that was a long 5-second pause. You could just see the gears malfunctioning. Barry had no fucking clue where he was going to take that thought. So Barry sucks at promos. That was kind of the main takeaway from all that. Now we had Mike Rotunda close out the show in a match with the Italian Stallion. Big selling point for the TV title match between Rotunda and Steiner is that Kevin Sullivan will be suspended above the ring in a shark cage. Why they felt the need to add that stipulation? Your guess is as good as mine. Because shark cages are cool. And/or every promoter/booker in the history of wrestling has a fetish for shark cages. So they talked about that on commentary. Rotunda went over with the butterfly suplex. It is kind of strange how they're doing a stipulation match where only one of the Varsity Club members has to hang above the ring in a cage. Dr. Death is apparently getting off completely scot-free. Are we just assuming Steve won't try to get involved? It's kind of odd. Who knows? I wasn't trying to gloss over some of the closing segments this week, but I was also kind of getting tired by this point in the show. There was a lot of shit happening this week. But the lack of interview time was very telling. That's something you can tell they modified very quickly under the new Turner regime. Which is stupid, because the interviews are what carry the bulk of these studio programs. The matches are utterly useless a lot of the time. Unless we have shit to complain about with how horrible the job guys are. But when you remove like 80% of the promo time they usually designate for the boys, I was like, what the fuck is the appeal? What am I watching for? A bunch of squash matches and mostly pre-taped interviews from other shows? I mean, yeah, we still got promos, but I don't know. There was a spark missing from this one. That's all I'm saying. But I think I've spent enough time on the TBS program. So let's move on and talk about this Mid-South show we got this week from 1983. We are 7 days removed from what is arguably the top story in the area at the moment. The official heel turn from Krusher Darsow, and the subsequent alignment with Nikolai Volkov, or as Bill Watts refers to him as, the Russian. Yeah, Nikolai did not pay off Darsow like General Skandar Akbar tried to do months ago. This is all free will on Darsow's part. Of his own volition, he stabbed all his fellow American comrades in the back. So the opening few minutes this week, they took the time to recap the footage we saw last week, including Darsow's very narrow-minded explanation as to why he picked Nikolai over everybody else. It was more than just an obsession with Nikolai's training and dedication to powerlifting. And Darsow also believed he never received his proper dues in Mid-South. After coming to the Junkyard Dog's aid on multiple occasions, never having been given a fair shake. And now he's seizing on those opportunities. And so fast forward, we get our very first look at the new and improved Krusher Darsow. And thank God Almighty he finally ditched the Daisy Dukes. I've been waiting for this moment since he debuted. He's now sporting red ring trunks with black boots and knee pads. He's also shaved his head, which was also a much improved look. I always thought Darsow looked better with the buzz cut anyway. You could kind of tell he was already losing his hair. These are all good changes. And he wrestled Mike Jackson, who was probably one of the better opponents they could have found to get Darsow's new heel persona over. It's great because, in addition to the new look, he's completely adapted his ring style to accommodate the heel gimmick. Yeah, he's still mostly using power moves, but now he's more fixated on letting things breathe, not being in a rush to get to the next spot. You know, he can milk the moments and try to get heat from the crowd by jaw-jacking with either them or his opponents. Again, these are all vast improvements from what they were doing with him previously. And he still won with the Canadian backbreaker hold. I love how now that he's a bad guy, though, he just drops his opponent from the shoulder position instead of gently letting them down. Could have probably ended poorly if he wasn't careful with how he did it. But that's a good touch. So immediately after the bell, here comes Nikolai to congratulate his new Russian ally. He is here to present Mr. Darsow with a gift, which turns out to be the Soviet Union flag, with the good old hammer and sickle logo. Karl Marx would have been proud. It was very strange, though, how they kept referring to it as the Russian flag throughout the program. But it wasn't the Russian flag. It was the Soviet Union flag. I mean, they just kind of used the term interchangeably, thinking nobody would notice. Russians, Soviets, who cares? They're all commies. I mean, technically that's not wrong. But for transparency purposes, it was the Soviet flag. Okay, now show of hands. Who else forgot that Hacksaw Reed and Jim Neidhart were the Mid-South Tag Team Champions? I sure did. I can't even remember the last time we saw these two defend the belts on television. Quite frankly, prior to this match, I don't even remember the last time I saw Butch Reed wrestle a match, period. Well, they took on Randy Barber and Coco Ware. Coco at this point was spelled with 2 C's as opposed to K's. Which I don't remember if that was something he exclusively did for in Mid-South, or if he still hadn't changed Coco to K-O-K-O. I'd have to go back and watch my Memphis tapes to clarify that, because now that I think of it, I don't know how he used to spell it. I just kind of assumed he always spelled it with a K. He also had already been in the business for a few years by this point. I think he and Norvell Austin were already doing the PYT's gimmick in Memphis. It was either 83 or sometime in 84 when that duo really took off. I've actually gone back and watched old tapes of when he was working with Jimmy Hart in the First Family. Back when he wrestled as Sweet Brown Sugar. Of course, there was that great storyline they developed over time where he and the First Family were getting sick of one another. Jimmy spent weeks bullying Coco on television and treating him like a second-class citizen. And eventually Coco got fed up with him and led to that awesome blow-up moment where Coco stood his ground and told Jimmy off. Now, of course, you have to consider it was the 80s, so the promos are a little sketchy if you're sensitive to racial commentary. I mean, let's just say there's no way they would get away with what they did in Memphis in 2024. Much, much different in the South back in the 80s. But, I don't know where I was going with that. I know I was talking a little bit about Koko Ware's backstory. I mean, he was just an underneath guy in Mid-South at this point. He'd come back later on in 84 with Norvell when they were actually doing the Pretty Young Things gimmick in Mid-South. Same thing when they went to Dallas that same year. I think Koko comes back in 86 to work for Watts right before he signs with Vince. By that point, it was the UWF, so I mean, most of my memories about Watts' promotion by that point are slim to none. I try not to think too much about Mid-South post-85, just for my own sanity. But this was just a get-over match for Reed and Neidhart. The ending was kind of clunky where... God, I don't even know what the hell they were trying to do here. I think Koko was going to break up a pin attempt after Neidhart at his fallaway slam on Barber. But apparently Koko didn't realize that was supposed to be the finish. So he goes to try to pull Neidhart off, but Neidhart doesn't budge. Then Johnny Martinez counts 3 anyway. So, I'm thinking there was a bit of a hostile confrontation about that afterwards. I mean, that totally could have killed Neidhart's finish had Johnny not kept counting. I don't know what Koko was thinking. Then we had Lanny Poffo beating Jeff Sword in a short match. They're still working the story of Lanny's recent confrontations with Mr. Wrestling 2 and Magnum TA. Again, when you consider that we've already discussed how that feud doesn't ever really go anywhere because Watts doesn't bring in Randy Savage to do the tag program, it is kind of awkward to hear them keep talking about it. But it was the only real central story to the match because elsewise it was just a get-over match for Lanny. I mean, he won with a standing moonsault. That's all there is to really say about it. By that same token, really not a whole lot to say about Magnum TA versus Tom Lentz. Now, the pre-tape they aired beforehand was the bigger topic of conversation coming out of it. We've obviously talked about the reason why Wrestling 2 has taken Magnum under his tutelage. He wants to teach Magnum everything he knows, and the end goal being one day that Magnum becomes the most successful singles wrestler of all time. So, naturally, as any great coach would do, he doesn't shy away from telling Magnum the cold, hard truth. If he sees something that Magnum does in a match that looks sloppy, or Magnum fucks something up, Wrestling 2 is going to let him have it. So they show us film of Magnum's North American title match with Butch Reed from a while back. And they're doing what is essentially coined in the business tape studying. Just like how the rookies are trained in developmental to watch footage and study the classics. That's what was going on here. Wrestling 2 is having Magnum watch his own match back to get a proper perspective on the pros and cons of what he did. And again, it's ideally what a good coach should do. Magnum's got tough skin, so he can handle the criticism. And, Wrestling 2's not being a dick just for the sake of being a dick. He wants Magnum to be the best. And when he's in there working with the North American champion, it's an indication that Magnum is in there against the best in the region. So any little subtle thing he does wrong, Reed is going to capitalize on it. And that was the goal of the pre-tape. To establish that Magnum doesn't have everything figured out yet. He's still got a lot to learn. But as long as he trusts Wrestling 2's input, he'll get better with time, and hopefully he won't make the same mistakes twice. And while granted, Magnum's match with Tom Lentz was not the same situation as him working with Butch Reed, but they did work the story of what we saw in the film pre-tape. Magnum was being more aggressive here and trying not to let his guard down long enough for Tom Lentz to cheat or gain the advantage. So even in a basic little squash like this, they gave you something to actively pay attention to as you're seeing the match unfold. And if, God forbid, we actually saw Magnum make a critical error here, we know Wrestling 2 is going to let him have it. I mean, I didn't really see anything that stood out here aside from one spot where Lentz tried to cheap shot Magnum near the ropes. But it's not like he took advantage of the match. Magnum just kind of fired back with an elbow shot and started beating the fuck out of him. But it was all very well done. I mean, at some point you're expecting it to turn into an abusive relationship. But it's not really that simple of a story. Trust me, they got plenty of ideas for the Magnum Wrestling 2 tag team as we head into 84. Maybe not what Watts initially intended, but it worked out. But now we flip the script back to the Russians for a moment here. We had Krusher Darsow in the ring with Jim Ross. And this was, this was peak Jim Ross right here, man. He was like the disappointed uncle trying to talk some sense into this Krusher Darsow. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't trying to admonish him or call him a despicable human being. He just looked Darsow in the eyes and said, I hope you understand what you're doing. I hope you understand that you've not only turned your back on your friends and family, you've also turned your back on this country. Of course, that also means turning your back on freedom and liberty. Everything the United States was founded on. But Darsow's set in his ways. He says that his country hasn't done a darn thing for him. I believe his exact quote was, "one bit of nothing." While Darsow's trying to justify his turn and prove to himself that he did the right thing, well, now JYD's got something to get off his chest. So he hits the ring and starts going back and forth with Darsow, telling Darsow that he's out here bitching and moaning about not getting a fair shake, that he didn't help Darsow make it to the main event. The dog says that he started from the bottom just like everybody else. And since no one else is here to slap any sense into Krusher, well, JYD's going to have to be the voice of reason. So he paintbrushes Darsow across the face. And that was the cue for Nikolai to hit the ring and go after Dog. And they gave you that brief teaser here that maybe Darsow was going to come to his senses. Maybe he realized he made the wrong decision. He hesitated. But then he started helping Nikolai go after Dog a second time. And that officially sealed his fate. So, of course, Watts is calling Darsow every name in the book. Turncoat, traitor, bootlicker. Any derogatory term he could get away with suitable for television. And the beatdown gets broken up after Magnum TA and Hacksaw Duggan run down to send the heels powdering. But it was a brilliant segment because, even though I think most people assumed Darsow had officially turned, you still had everybody trying to talk sense into him. JR's out there telling him, you can still rectify all this. You can still apologize and pretend what we saw earlier didn't happen. Of course, Darsow had one final opportunity to second-guess his decision. But he couldn't do it. He is fully bought into the Russian propaganda. And now there's no going back. Of course, that led to Bill Watts going into his political tirade after the break, making sure to let everybody across the nation know Russians are cold-blooded, lying, manipulative propagandists. That it's time for Americans to put aside their personal and political differences and come together to fight one common enemy. Those no-good Russians. And again, you have to remember the time period we're talking about. International conflict was a hot button issue for most Americans in the political landscape. Kind of like how today, I think most people would say the big hot button issue is the economy and border security. So when you see Watts presenting these kinds of stories on TV and staking his claims openly to the public, I mean, you have to understand where he's coming from, given the state of where the world was in 1983. A lot of it is still kayfabe, yes, but there are plenty of emotions being poured out in the context of everything we're seeing. And, you know, some people might not like it, but sometimes those are the best stories in wrestling. The ones that effectively blur the lines between fake and reality. I mean, did people actually believe Krusher Darsow was a Russian affiliate? Probably not. But because of the conflict with the Cold War, you know, the general state of unpredictability in the world around this time, you could see why fans were super passionate about this kind of stuff. You know, by today's standards, it'd be equivalent to them doing some kind of story involving an Iranian coming in to call out the Americans for their morals and values. Of course, WWE tried that story at one point with Muhammad Hassan, and look how that turned out. Now, in addition to everything they're currently doing with Duggan and JYD, their ongoing beef with the Russians, we've also got Dr. Death looming in the backdrop, waiting for his chance to lock horns with Nikolai. So they put together a cool little pre-tape with some of the camera crew filming him at University of Oklahoma, which, I don't know, maybe it's just historical perspective. The visual of seeing Dr. Death Steve Williams walk around campus while carrying textbooks in his varsity attire, it was so weird. He's just a good old college boy going to school and trying to make a career for himself. Meanwhile, you fast forward several years later and he's total badass beating up dudes and throwing them around on Crockett television. One of the scariest athletes in the world. But in 1983, he's just like all the other college kids. But again, it was cool. You know, they had JR talking about his training and his preparation for the match with Nikolai. They showed him in the gym doing some bench pressing, him on the football field training. I dug it. It was very simplistic, but it worked. Kind of wish we saw more of this stuff in modern wrestling, without all the goofy theatrics and overproduction. And from there we had the Iceman going up against Doug Vines, which was basically one giant infomercial so that Bill Watts could talk about, you guessed it, Russia. We ought to start a drinking game on the channel. Anytime Watts directly mentions or starts going on rants about Russian politics, take a shot. And then immediately regret it when you die of liver failure after the first show. The Iceman won with a hip attack. I really didn't write anything else down about it. I like King Parsons, but he never did jack shit in Mid-South, other than the occasional cameo appearance to work matches and get the people to shake their booties a little bit. I mean, it worked, but there was no story reason for it. He was just being the Iceman. Then we closed out with a Midnight Express squash with George Weingroff and John King. Corny was a little more colorful with his choice of ring attire this week. A red suit jacket to match the black slacks and white shirt. I mean, it is a holiday season. The match was literally 45 seconds long. Midnights went over with their elevated atomic drop doomsday combo. I screamed when I saw John King come down and land right on the side of his head. Thankfully, he wasn't dead after taking the bump. The other thing I thought when the match was over, thank God beautiful Bobby ditched those ugly-looking tights later on. I used to see him wrestle in those dual-colored leggings where you had the mismatched purple and blue running up the opposite sides of his leg. It was the most hideous ring gear I've ever seen. Meanwhile, Dennis is out there in standard red trunks. Took the Midnights a while to actually work out getting matching ring gear. I think it was a running gag for me for the longest time. Will Bobby and Dennis actually color coordinate this week? They never would. If Bobby was wearing blue, Dennis was wearing red. If Dennis was wearing blue, Bobby was wearing pink or purple. I used to think they were doing it on purpose just to get heat with me. Maybe they were. Who knows? But yeah, not really a whole lot going on this week outside the continuation of everything they're doing with Darsow and Nikolai Volkov. I like the flow of this week's show a lot better than last week. You know, they had a nice stream of pre-tapes to break up the matches throughout. You know, and they weren't extremely long pre-tapes, but it was kind of helpful in not making things so square with the formatting. Yes, the Watts' obsession over Russian politics became a bit much. I just sort of got used to it after a while. I mean, I could definitely see how annoying it would be for a lot of people, especially the fans that strictly watch pro wrestling to escape the real world. And Watts wasn't going to let those people have a day off. But yeah, those are the two main stories this week. Krusher Darsow's heel turn follow-up and Bill Watts hates Russia. All right, so let's get into week 2 of the Thanksgiving Star Wars special. It is a double main event feature. Even though Bill Mercer kind of openly said, well, Kevin and Kerry versus Gino and Chris is the real main event, but we've also got this cage match with Scott Casey and John Tatum that nobody cares about. Yeah, the cage gimmick was definitely the focus of this week's program. And bearing in mind they taped a lot of these matches out of order, I'm not sure if they just kept the cage up to do both the cage matches back to back, or if they tore the cage down and then set it back up later on. My presumption is that they just taped both cage matches in succession, which would have made the most logistical sense. That also meant in part, if you were one of the fans in attendance, the two big featured matches for the card, you basically had to wait until the end of the taping block to see them. Knowing me, I probably would have been bird town by the time we got to Kerry and Kevin versus Gino and Chris. But that's just me. I'm sort of convinced the Texas fans don't ever get fatigued during live events. They're always on their feet screaming and cheering for something. I mean, they were even lively for the Kamala one-man gang match that opened the card. Which was strange when you consider you had two heels going at it here. And we haven't seen Kamala in Dallas for well over a year. Skandar Akbar, same deal. And like, Gang is somebody they've been pushing on television, but he's been an established villain since the breakup with Gary Hart. But I think the people kind of chose him over Kamala as the guy to root for here. Now, of course, the obvious question, why did they just randomly have a battle of the giants between Gang and Kamala with no build-up? Why not? That's my answer. Why the hell not? Who cares that we haven't seen Kamala or the General on Dallas television in well over 12 months? We'll just bring him right back and put him in the ring with a one-man gang. And people will care. If I remember correctly, this would have been just shortly after Kamala's first run in the WWF. I mean, I know he went back in '86 after he wrapped up his runs in places like Dallas and I think the AWA. That's where he worked with Slaughter, right? It was just so weird to see him show up here unannounced. Pretty sure this may have been his last ever appearance. And boy, what a way to go out. A horrible sloppy brawl with one-man gang that ends in a disqualification when gang shoves Bronco over. I mean, there's literally nothing to comment on with the match because not a fucking thing happened. Aside from them going out to the floor and pretending to choke one another with the safety rope. The rest of it was slow plotting big guy stuff. And then gang chased Kamala and Akbar off through the crowd with his chain. It was just so disappointing when we look back and see how prominent Kamala was in places like Dallas and even Mid-South at one point in time. You go back to 82 and 83. I mean, we were covering Kamala with pretty much every single episode. By the time he had established himself through so many regions in the country, I don't know, he never really stayed put anywhere on a long-term basis. It was kind of like the Andre factor. He was seen as more of an attraction type seller for cards, so he kept bouncing from region to region. It's not a bad thing per se, but he never really had any long-term feuds after like 84. Yeah, we all know Vince was never going to make him world champion or anything, so I don't know, he always just kind of fell into a box with WWF. Sort of like he muddled around the mid-card after the feud with Hogan. And it's also been a while since I've studied up on Kamala's latter WWF run, because, God, I know he was there like 2 or 3 times. When did he feud with Jake Roberts? That was later on, right? Same with Taker and Bret Hart. Or no, maybe Taker and Bret would have been 91 or 92. I don't know. But you see what I'm talking about, right? It's just, he never stayed put in any one location for a long period of time. And again, I'm not saying they were bad feuds. They were just kind of forgettable feuds in the grand scheme of history. Maybe not as forgettable as Jack Victory versus Brian Adias for the Texas Heavyweight title. But that kind of goes without saying. I mean, everything about Brian Adias as the Texas Heavyweight Champion has been forgettable. God almighty, dude. The more I see of this guy, I mean, I get it, Diaz was childhood friends with the Von Erichs, but you want to talk about bland white meat personalities that never should have been pushed to the degree they were. I present to you Brian Adias, the guy with the personality of curdling milk. I mean, the match they had was fine. You know, there was a backstory dating back to the Cotton Bowl last month. But, like, what is there to say about it? It's Brian Adias and Jack Victory. And the people like Brian, so they got behind him during the critical heat moments in the match. Made a comeback on Victory after he missed a charge in the corner. In the, well, the story of their match from the stadium show was Adias trapping Victory in the spinning toe hold, long enough to where Victory eventually passed out from the pain. So, of course, they do one spot where Adias teases the spinning toe hold, but Victory gets the ropes. And like a minute later, Adias just comes off the middle rope with a crossbody and pins him. Great attention to story continuity, fellas. I just talk about it all the time, dude. This is the star power they had to work with in 1985. I know people often criticize 86 and 87 and even 88 as being abysmal years for world class. Trust me, they were. But 85 was just as terrible. I mean, they still had a few redeemable moments throughout the year. But just like, I don't know, the fact that Brian Adiz and Jack Victory was one of the featured title matches on this card. Only in Texas would something like that draw a house. But anyway, let's talk about the cage matches. And of course, here we have our first dilemma. They promoted the match as John Tatum versus Scott Casey. But A, they don't bother to explain what the stipulation is regarding the girls, i.e. Missy Hyatt and Sunshine. They're presumed to be the corner women for their designated party, yet they were literally inside the cage. So was it a mixed tag? I don't know. I mean, the girls got involved, but the men did 99% of the work here. Sunshine and Missy just stood on the apron watching most of the time. And at the point they did run interference, nobody was disqualified. So that end result brings up the second issue at hand. The fact that because the girls were inside the cage, giving the impression to the fans that they were part of the match to begin with, I mean, the people really didn't give a shit about anything the guys did. They just wanted to see the girls get into a cat fight. Which, to be fair, has been the main selling point of this program since they brought Missy in. And they still pop for things here and there. They especially went crazy whenever somebody tried to leave through the cage door. So it was indeed escape the cage rules. I guess that was sort of a given, like we were just expected to know that. And again, it's not to say the work in the match was bad. It was actually pretty good. You know, Tatum and Casey treated it like a grudge feud. They were utilizing the cage as a weapon, throwing each other into it constantly. Nobody gigged, but really didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, I guess. But at the end of the day, even when you account for all that brutal punishment the guys put each other through, who did the people care about? The girls. Because they were the draw. It's a Sunshine Precious principle all over again. I mean, yeah, Jimmy Garvin and Chris Adams did the bulk of the work in that feud when it came to the matches, but who are the people primarily paying tickets to see? Sunshine tear Precious's hair out. It's kind of the same psychology here with her and Missy. Looking back, though, there were a few things here that really didn't make sense to me. Okay, maybe I'm just misremembering things because this is a lot of information to keep track of. The match was originally supposed to be Kabuki versus Scott Casey, correct? But then we were hearing from Bill Mercer that Kabuki was allegedly back in Japan, which turned out to be a lie when the match was over. The other thing, wasn't Missy Hyatt pissed off at John Tatum a couple weeks ago? Remember there was that tag match where she was acting really cold towards him? Like they were teasing some sort of breakup? Well, they seem to be fine here. So I guess they made up. I don't know what the deal was with that angle then, if you can even call it an angle. It was more of a story plot hole. In any case, so they get to the end where Missy shakes the rope so Casey accidentally crotches himself. There was already a spot where Tatum had taken a bump off the side of the cage and landed in the middle of the ring. But because he was closer to the door and had enough time to recover, he just crawled out the cage door after Casey had scrotinized himself. And, the afterbirth was where the real chaos ensued. First, Sunshine went directly after Missy. So they had their little brawl, which everybody was anticipating before the bell rang. And while they're going at it, Kabuki makes his way into the cage and starts beating up Casey. This is where we will learn that Kabuki was not, in fact, in Japan, as many were led to believe. So while he and Casey are brawling, you see Kabuki put the nerve hold on Sunshine and basically drag her out of the cage so he can trap himself inside with Casey. The only flaw in Kabuki's logic here was that, well, there was no padlock on the cage, so everybody could just freely enter the cage at will, which is exactly what happened as everybody started clearing out from the locker room to try to break up the fight. But the post-match I thought was well done. It was a hot angle. People were into it. And like I said, the match was good. Boys worked hard and tried to put together a reasonable grudge fight. But like I said, people are just kind of waiting around to see Missy and Sunshine go at it. I'm convinced Casey and Tatum could have set each other on fire and the crowd wouldn't have cared if the girls didn't fight. The one thing I can never deny about Missy Hyatt, she had a ton of heat with the Texans. That Valley girl-like attitude really got under people's skins, I'll tell you. And I've said it before, I was never a huge Missy Hyatt fan growing up, but she was a good heat magnet in certain situations. And all that led to our second double main event feature. It is Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams going up against Kerry and Kevin Von Erich. They also had to muddy up the waters here by assigning like 4 goddamn referees for this thing. I guess just to make sure we had a clear-cut winner. I've heard of 2 referees, but 4 seems like overkill to me. So here's what they did. In addition to David Manning and Bronco Lubitsch being on the floor, we also had, for reasons that were not explained, by the way, Brian Adias and Terry Gordy as the officials in the ring. Well, reverting back to what I said earlier, why not? Just bring Terry Gordy back unannounced to referee a cage match main event. Why are we asking questions? It's world class in 1985. It's not like there was a whole lot of thought being put into most of the booking anyway. And that's not me ragging on Terry or anything, but it's like the Kamala discussion we had. When the hell was the last time Terry Gordy was on Dallas television? Months? He just randomly shows up here to be a referee? You don't even bother to advertise his appearance ahead of time? Yeah, I get he and Kerry made amends all those months ago. It was a pretty big deal at the time. But then Gordy vanished and there was never really any follow-up with his face turn after the fact. 3 years of story build-up for that moment. And we never heard from the fucking guy again. Of course, by the time this segment was over, that face turn really didn't mean jack shit. Because he ended up being one of the focal stories in the match here. Because all throughout the bout, Kevin and Kerry are constantly going after the heels' masks. And, well, despite the fact that Gordy really had no reason to, given it was no DQ anyway, I guess he wanted the boys to wrestle a clean fight. So he's constantly getting in Kevin and Kerry's face, telling him not to remove the masks and just be professional or something. And it eventually boils over to where Brian Adias tries to talk some sense into Terry, but then Terry shoves Brian out of the way and basically levels him with a punch. So then we get Gordy flipping his lid and kicking the cage door open so he can leave. And Mercer reminded everybody of the cage incident back in December of '82 when Gordy lashed out in that cage match. Of course, that angle also brought Dallas the biggest money feud they'd ever generate as an organization. Here it was just a throwaway angle they put in the middle of a blood feud involving other talents. So Gordy walks off through the crowd. The match continues. And I will admit, the last few minutes were pretty good. First, they remove Chris's mask. And kind of like what we alluded to a while ago, Chris and Gino had basically grown their hair back by this point. So the angle did not expose them as bald-headed geeks like everybody was wanting. They just essentially had crew cuts. But while Kevin and Kerry are working over Chris, Gino puts a gimmick inside the hood of his mask, so when Kerry turns around, Gino can headbutt him and pin him. So amidst all that chaos and pandemonium, the heels do reclaim the American Tag Team titles. And for those of you wondering, yes, this match was for the Tag Team Championships. I literally did not realize that until Mark Lawrence made the announcement. And of course, since Gino still had his mask on, they shot the bit where Lance tried to trap Gino in the cage, so that way Kevin and Kerry could go after Gino and rip his mask off, which ended up revealing that Gino had even more hair than Chris did. I was also expecting like a reverse decision where they revealed the gimmick inside the hood. Apparently no. Kerry had the mask, but they just totally ignored it. I mean, I get it was a phantom gimmick. There wasn't anything inside the hood, but I don't know, you could pretend you're holding something in your hand. Like, remember when your dad used to pretend to pull your nose as a kid? I don't know, Kerry could have done something like that. I'm obviously being facetious, but I don't know. There was a germ of an idea here. The stuff with Gordy just seemed really random and haphazardly thrown together. Like, why did he care so much about Kevin and Kerry going after the heels' masks? By all accounts, wouldn't Terry want to see the heels exposed? Unless he's working hand in hand with them, which could happen. I don't really remember. But then he just gets fed up and leaves the cage. All because Brian and Diaz got physical with him. There was just a lot going on here. I'm not entirely sure if it was a proper place and time to do it all. Because now I'm trying to remember, is Gordy even around World Class through much of 86? I thought 86 was when he went to the UWF to work for Watts. So what was the point of this angle if we're not even really going to see Gordy much after this? Maybe he sticks around for a taping block, but it's got to be short-lived. And there were things to like about this match, no doubt. It kind of had the vibe of an old-school pandemonium world-class main event like we got back in 82 and 83. Even bits and pieces of 84, I guess. But it kind of got busy and overbooked without really having much of a cohesive structure to it. Yeah, like sometimes you can get away with hotshot booking, but again, it's all about timing and placement. I mean, you already did enough by having Gino hit Kerry in the head with a gimmick mask. It was already tornado roll, so there was already enough crap to keep track of as it was. I don't know, the Gordy thing just felt like a supplementary angle that really didn't need to be there. But they accomplished getting the belts back on the heels, despite removing their masks and letting everybody know, hey, these guys have their hair back. It was a rather underwhelming reveal. For some reason, I had it wired in my head that it was actually going to be 3 weeks they were airing this on tape delay, but now that I look, I think they covered all the matches from the special. Because next week they advertised Kerry Von Erich and Rick Rude for the American Heavyweight title. which ought to be interesting. And you can see, too, they're slowly trying to implement Lance into more and more of these main event programs. It's temporarily working in the sense that the fans are still cheering for him. Unfortunately, we all know that doesn't last long, especially as the fans get more exposure of him. But we're only a few weeks away from the new year. And as we've been building up for a while, 1986 is really where things turn for the worse. And we've already hit plenty of roadblocks along the way when it comes to booking and general lack of fan fatigue, especially with a lot of these higher ticket cards. I mean, remember when we compared the Texas Stadium house numbers from 85 to 86? I mean, those look like AEW attendance figures. Just a massive dip. And there's still a lot of stuff that happens just within the first few months of World Class in 86. I mean, you got the NWA withdrawal and Fritz parting ways with the working agreement with Crockett. Gino's death. That's coming up pretty soon. That was a huge black eye on the company. Them rebranding as the World Class Wrestling Association. And by midway through the year, Fritz decided not to book shows outside the Dallas market, which in turn led to him and Ken Mantell parting ways and him going to work for Watts. Just, all kinds of bad business decisions and not so good things that are about to happen over the next year. And they were pretty much coasting along from that point forward until things really went to hell in a handbasket in 1990. But, the bloom was already well off the rose by that point. It was only a matter of time. It was like the dying days of Nitro, dude. You saw shit hit the fan after the Sting Hogan debacle, and you were just counting down the years at that point. So, we covered a lot today, and we're going to be covering a lot on Monday's show as well. So I think I talked about this. Actually, I did talk about this at the top of the show. We got 3 segments to review this coming Monday. They are all WWE related. I'm going to see how much of the Saturday night's main event PLE I want to watch. I might not even recap the whole thing. I'll see how much time I have. I've already watched the next In Your House, and I still have to watch Retro Raw, but that's only about an hour or so. That'll be the plan. And as of now, I guess I could go ahead and check again. I think it was the last time I looked at the Saturday night's main event PLE, there were like 4 matches announced. Of course, it's going to redirect me to the top of the page because going all the way back to 85 when the first one was? Yeah, 1985. Man. Yeah, they have 5 matches now. They've added... Which one did they add? Crap, now I can't even remember. Oh, Sami Zayn and Drew McIntyre. That's a new one. Yeah. That must have been a recent angle they shot on Raw. Holy cow. Here's some odd trivia for you. So, prior to this Saturday night's main event, the very last one that WWE ran was July 28th, 2008, from Washington, D.C. at the Verizon Center. Oh, God. Get a load of this trailblazing card. In a dark match, Paul London defeated Charlie Haas. That's criminal. There was an 8-man tag with JBL, Kane, and Legacy, which was Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase. I assume that's Ted DiBiase Jr. God, remember when he was in the business? They defeated John Cena, Batista, and Crime Time. Good old Crime Time. I remember them. The Great Khali defeated Jimmy Wang Yang. Minute and a half. And then Edge defeated Jeff Hardy in the main event. It was a 1-hour special that drew a 1.4 rating. It aired on NBC. Holy shit. Yeah. That was the mid-2000s for you. Times were rough. People paid a ticket to see the Great Khali wrestle Jimmy Wang Yang. That is all you need to know. Hopefully this one's a lot better than that piece of shit card. I should go back and review all the Saturday night's main events. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't have that much time and or patience. All right, folks. We'll see you on Monday. Take care. Peace out.